And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on. And so on and so on.
So want to get that nice room sound, that hall reverb going.
Yeah.
It was an echoey room. One of you had it. I don't remember who it was. It was me. I just need more stuff. It's a symptom of material poverty. So if you're listening and you want to help with that, subscribe to our Patreon. $5 a month. You get access to the Discord, and extra episodes, and knowing that you're making a difference, if not in the world, then in our lives.
Absolutely. And, once again, GJEC and so on relies on listener support. So help keep the podcast running. Give us $5 a month.
GJEC and so on. I'm Peter. Who else we got here?
Michael.
Hi, William here.
See what I do? See what I do? I let you introduce yourselves now.
I think I need to. I think I need to change it.
Yeah,
I like
why
it when
do
you
for you.
We've always had trouble doing that, and it's always been me and Jake fucking it up and either introducing each other or just one of us.
Yeah, I was really close to introducing you.
Allow myself to introduce yourself. It's like hi, I'm no, I'll take this over from here. This is Michael. Hi, I'm Michael.
Everybody misses out on how exaggerated your open mouth is when you're doing this. Hello.
Well, you got to get those round vowels going,
Yeah.
So we're going from the voice to the gaze.
Yeah, we're going from the anal object to the voice to the gaze.
Oh yeah, I went to the day after we recorded our episode. I went with a friend and watched a Buster Keaton movie, a silent film, and a couple things grabbed my notice after our episode. One in particular, I mean, the point about the singularity of the action in those kinds of slapstick silent films, I found really interesting because it's very true in this instance. There's no action that's outside of this sort of synchronic action in the movie. Like the action is all kind of like it's all there. It's all
everything is revealed.
Yeah,
for the eye. Yeah,
and sewn together.
And there's also no like simultaneity of what do you call that? Like the two.
Oh, like parallel montage.
Yeah,
that's it,
yeah. It's not implying anything other than the action, what's going on the screen.
Mm-hmm. And
because it's
also
because of the lack,
as much as it can be the case. It's funny. It's like the action isn't lacking. I mean, it's lacking speech. But there is this like discomfiture in the fact that the feeling is, at least mine, is that it should have speech to augment it, but it really doesn't need it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess at that point there would be nothing lacking from the viewer in that moment, but now it seems particularly bereft of something when you look back at it.
And there was this is the one I saw is called The General, and it's got this. I mean, it's amazing, like train sequences. It's got the famous one of the train driving onto the burned out bridge and it falls into the river. I mean, they must have actually done that, right?
Yeah, 100%.
It's crazy.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Is it Buster Keaton or where the train's going really slowly and he's repairing the track? And he's like,
that's
out of the way.
That's
That's so
yeah.
good. Yeah. That's crazy that I did that.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah. Sitting on the cow catcher, like the very front of the train. That
yeah.
What else was it?
We read about that Buster Keaton movie recently for something. Do you remember what it was?
It's something that Todd talks about. I know that.
Yeah, Todd talks about it. Well, I can't remember reading something about it recently.
So I did the reading, and I wanted to get a basis in the contra opinion.
Wait, first, should we describe what we read? Like the
Yeah.
title?
Yeah, we read an essay today by one Todd McGowan, and it's called "Looking for the Gaze: Lacanian Film Theory and Its Vicissitudes."
That it is.
Yep. It was published in Society for Cinema and Media Studies.
2003?
Yeah, 2003.
The year that Michael wore his Wayfarers. Big year.
It was a big year.
Big year, yeah. Iraq War.
The Up in Smoke tour on DVD.
What else was going on?
A young Joe Piscopo.
I believe Return of the King came out that year.
Yeah. So after reading Todd's essay, I wanted to go back and get a sense of what he was talking about. Well, really, actually, it was a link on. We watched part of his video on the gaze on his YouTube channel, and one of the links on that was just from like one of these normie YouTube accounts. I forget what it was called, but she was doing like she was instructing. It was a video on the gaze, right? And she was talking about the 2019 movie Lady on Fire. And it was exactly this point of, she says that the power of the gaze, the use of the word power there, I think, is instructive. How it can simultaneously oppress us, liberate us, and allow us to transcend space and time.
Sweet. Sounds awesome.
But it's this idea that, the gaze is either a mode of oppression or something that can be like taken up and used for oneself in their own individual expression.
Can you like what, reversing the gaze? Like rather than sexualizing women on screen?
Yeah. So it's like, this idea that, I get the typical notion of object in this sense, or is objectifying, like you just said. So like Lacan is talking about the object in a very different way, obviously. But I think the typical notion is that the gaze objectifies in the sense of, that women are objectified in films. Turns them into an object to be looked at.
By both the filmmaker and the viewer.
Mm-hmm.
And the camera.
Yeah. Yeah, specifically the camera, I think. Because supposedly the idea is that there's some kind of identification with the camera. The camera has the gaze.
That you as the viewer occupy.
Yeah. And that's where the idea is that's where the mastery comes in.
Is not the implication then, that the supposed viewer is always male?
Well, yeah, that's the idea. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this notion of the male gaze.
Yeah. But it doesn't that do the similar thing that Zizek's critique of Eurocentrism does, where by critiquing the European tradition as the white male tradition or whatever, it acknowledges it unintentionally as the universal position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the point in this video was that Lady on Fire, which is a film about two women falling in love, she says that the film shows us how true love, the willingness to gaze upon someone, to truly see them, and accept the same in return, shows that love can stand the test of time. A less Lacanian point I've never heard. I've never heard.
Stand the test of time is the point that you made, that you said earlier, where the gaze allows us to break the bounds of time and space.
Mm-hmm.
I see.
Yeah.
I don't know what there is really to say about that. Other than it just feels very, very incorrect.
Wait, because it's a love story between two women, it breaks the hold of the male gaze.
Yeah.
Of the man gaze.
And and so the two characters in the film come to truly see each other. It's this idea of the gaze as real, complete seeing.
Right, and it also supposes that the film exists over here on one hand and the viewer over here on the other, and that their love story can kind of exist within the film, absent a viewer.
Right. Yeah. And this is drawing on, I don't know if she named her, but what's her first name? Mulvey?
Laura
Mulvey's essay on the male gaze, which is a very consequential essay. And when people hear that phrase, the male gaze, it sounds like, it's pretty.
It's a pretty convincing term. Yeah, it's like it's pretty. Yeah, it seems pretty obvious what is meant.
My friend once asked me if he had the male gaze when he was cutting carrots.
I think that's more of castration. Than
yeah. But it's this idea that the gaze is essentially a kind of either a liberatory gesture or a kind of aggressive force that's imposed on objects. And it's this.
Actually,
objectifying looks.
It seems that this person is saying that. However, I think what Todd is describing the Lacanian, the standard Lacanian film analysis.
Set that up a little bit, So I was just trying to start on the kind of parochial, like how you might encounter the gaze, just in pop culture on YouTube, whatever.
Well, I mean, I think what that example is like the standard kind of political narrative these days of like reappropriating something and reversing it as a kind of site of liberation, right? Yeah. So he starts describing the kind of standard Lacanian school of film analysis.
Right.
I got some excerpts here.
I guess actually to set this up just one more time, how do we arrive at this topic for this week?
Through Hitchcock, right?
Right.
Available in our exclusive patron feed.
And we were talking about the Zizek's phrase, the Hitchcockian blot, the element in Hitchcock's films that sort of in some way incorporate the viewer, the spectator, into the film. The prime example being the overhead objective shot of the gas station on fire in the film Birds, into which the viewer thinks they get kind of like this objective shot of the situation, the bird's eye view, so to speak. But then the birds enter the frame, and you become aware that you're seeing the below scene from their angle. Yeah,
a bird's eye view, if you will.
Yeah, and this is the distinction between objet and object of desire.
Right.
So in the Birds, the object of the spectator's desire is a successful escape from these birds, but the objet is actually the birds themselves.
Right, and we realize in this tracking shot that the apparent neutral objective shot from above of the scene below is actually the view of the birds. The birds themselves are this kind of chaotic manifestation of the mother's desire, correct? Or the failure of the maternal superego to symbolize.
Yes. Yeah.
So we're thinking about the gaze, and
another obvious connection with Hitchcock would be Rear Window, where it's all about the gaze. And as Zizek describes, his focus on the window is an attempt to distract himself from his failure to connect with Grace Kelly.
Yeah. And importantly, the point of the gaze in Rear Window is when Jeff sees the neighbor and they lock eyes. And it's this moment of, what do you want from me? What is it that you desire?
Right. Yeah. So Todd does say that the kind of privileged medium of thinking about the gaze is film. And so we're here back again talking about film.
So maybe a good place to start is where he starts. Maybe I'll just read the first paragraph. Todd writes, no one theory predominates in film studies today. What is more, different approaches no longer seem to vie for hegemony, but instead seem to accept a peaceful coexistence. Amid this contemporary landscape, a universal and totalizing theory of the filmic experience seems outdated. As the editors of Post Theory put it, film studies is a historical juncture which might be described as the waning of capital T theory. This waning has occurred largely in response to the universalizing pretensions of the film theory of the 70s and 80s, especially the theory associated with psychoanalysis and Jacques Lacan.
So his point here is that actually, aside from the universal applicability of Lacan's concepts, we have basically a universal misconception of Lacan's concepts with regard to film.
Yeah, it's interesting where he's saying that the Lacanian school of film analysis is like a kind of misapprehension, according to Todd, of Lacan because of its focus on certain elements of Lacan at the absence of other elements.
Yeah, and so he says that we need to be basically, aside from getting away from Lacan, we have to be more Lacanian in our analysis.
What's that you were describing, Michael, where it's like one of the key statements of the Slovenian school is Hegel was not being Hegelian enough, the Lacanian school was not being Lacanian enough, Marx was not Marxian enough. Is that right?
No, it's more like the phrase that's like rather than virtual reality, the reality of the virtual. A phrase like that.
Well, okay. I would like to add this to the mix of key insights.
Mm-hmm.
Not as a way of diminishing it, but it is a recognizable tool.
So basically what we're looking at is Todd, for a few pages, outlines the history of traditional Lacanian application for film theory.
Mm-hmm.
And for him, he's saying that the focus traditionally was on the imaginary and the symbolic elements of Lacan's triad. And what was missing, of course, was the real. And the primary text historically for Lacanian film analysis was the mirror stage,
right?
Which is very early in Lacan's development.
Yeah.
And the idea being that in the mirror stage, an infant is looking at a mirror and experiences itself as a composite of disparate elements.
Mm-hmm.
But in the mirror, it sees itself as whole. And what underlies the traditional analysis is the idea of the mastery of the wholeness of the body.
Right. Yeah. From that site, the gaze represents a kind of point of identification of as you said, a kind of wholeness.
Yeah, like where the subjecthood of the child looking in the mirror is sort of sutured together, becomes apparently whole. Is that what?
And the way this works in film is like via the viewer's gaze in the film, it's a site of ideological like interpolation or ideological manifestation, where through the film, like as in the mirror, the subject comes to understand themselves, right?
Right, like the gaze is somehow like delineates a certain way of looking, which in film studies has been expressed through the notion of the male gaze. But like Michael, you were just saying, Todd's saying that the register of the real is omitted.
Sorry, before that, let's just really flesh this out. Todd writes, according to Lacanian film theorists, film, like the mirror stage, is an imaginary deception, a lure blinding us to the underlying symbolic structure. The gaze is a function of the imaginary, the key to the imaginary deception that takes place in the cinema.
Yeah, and he says further that like the focus of this type of critique is almost exclusively on the spectator's identification with the gaze, with this gaze. But it leaves something out. It leaves out the register of the real, and towards that he says the omission is crucial because the real provides the key to understanding the radical role that the gaze plays within the filmic experience. Basically to say that it's not as simple as the role of the camera being the medium of the gaze.
Yeah. So rather than the gaze being something that the subject has, it's something that the object has.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The film gazes.
Because basically the central concern of film analysis was you go into a darkened room like the dream state and you presented a series of images on the screen and you're primed for ideological interpolation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we also see this, maybe as the, in Adorno's writing on the culture industry, for instance.
Yeah. And so they thought that they could problematize the way in which film is experienced by the spectator by, like, how would you say it? Like the advent of a concept like male gaze comes from the idea that the camera itself isn't neutral.
Mm-hmm.
What it's capturing is already loaded with meaning.
Yeah. And of course, like, in some sense, that's obviously true, but it's not grasping the full process, I think, is what Todd is saying here.
Yeah. So absolutely. Because Mulvey's definitely right about the way in which women are represented in film in classic Hollywood. And that idea of, like, she calls it the looked atness of women in film, where, the camera will move from, like, a woman's legs up to her torso, up to her breasts. Clearly, like, the position is like of that of a desirous subject.
Right. But
what she doesn't take into account is, so I guess, like, then it's not nitpicky, but it's the idea that the application of gaze isn't Lacanian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really what it is the kind of combining of almost a term from Lacan with a Nietzschean and Foucaultian image of power.
Exactly.
Which would be like, for Nietzsche, our desire is for power, right? The will to power, right?
Yep.
And for Foucault, it's that the gaze fundamentally is one of power.
Yeah.
For example, in the Panopticon.
A desire for mastery, like not to see desire in the psychoanalytic sense, but to understand it as a desire for power or desire for mastery.
Yeah, desire is rendered in a very kind of like unidirectional way here.
Yeah. And Todd quotes Joan Kopchak here, and she says that film theory operated a kind of Foucaultinization of Lacanian theory. For both Nietzsche and Foucault, power wholly informed desire. The filmic experience is thus an experience in which we gain power over the object, and when we desire in the cinema, we desire to dominate.
Right. And that's where he goes on to reference, I think it's Studler, problematizing it, saying that there's another kind of desire that precedes that of mastery. Because what's implicit in Mulvey and so on is that the sort of fundamental motivation is mastery or domination, right? Mm-hmm. And Studler is saying that there's one that precedes that, which is the desire to submit, a masochistic passive desire. But Lacan, of course, doesn't see desire being fundamentally masochistic. The idea is that desire is motivated by objet art, a mysterious object that the subject posits in the other,
with the aim of catching the jouissance of the other.
Yeah, that's crucial. And I thought he described it so well in this essay, that the attempt of the subject's gaze is to capture the jouissance of the other.
He doesn't say this explicitly, but he implies it by saying that, like, interpreting it in this way is in some sense phallocentric, phallus oriented.
Yeah.
He says that rather than seeking power or mastery, in parentheses the phallus, our desire is drawn to the opposite, the point at which power is entirely lacking, the point of total jouissance. So, like, this criticism, and apt criticism in a lot of ways, still is kind of like in the mode of this phallus oriented seeing.
It still takes it for granted that the process exists in that way.
Yeah.
And that's the same move that you were highlighting before, Pete.
Yeah. That it still hinges upon a kind of centering of the very thing that they're critiquing.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Enjoy the music for a minute.
disturbs us being the enjoyment of others is a very crucial and interesting point.
Definitely. And like the things that there's two aspects of Lacan's analysis that Todd wants to focus on here is the notion of the objet a and desire and jouissance, right?
Yeah. So there's the Lacanian film school. There's the critique of the Lacanian film school, which is kind of standard these days, that it's too like totalizing.
Mhm.
And then there's what Todd is advocating, that to make even more thoroughly Lacanian film analysis.
Right.
Yeah, because I think interestingly, the primary criticism of the post-theory crowd is that Lacanian concepts get applied to cinema without regards for the spectator, like the experience of the spectator themselves.
Uh-huh.
So he says something, what is it? They construct theories of spectatorships from which spectators are missing.
Yeah, right. That's the criticism about traditional Lacanian film theory.
Yeah,
isn't it?
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, the point that Todd's trying to make is that what the traditional Lacanian film school misses is the subject's desire and a properly applied Lacanian gaze,
because it fails to grasp the role of the real in the dynamic of film.
Yeah.
This being expressed through the notion of the objet a, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
like
looking
okay,
at
if we're thinking about desire here, okay, desire in the simplistic terms of a desire for mastery or for power. Okay, this is clearly not what Lacan is talking about. Todd says desire is motivated by the mysterious object that the subject posits in the other, the objet petit a. But the subject relates to this object in a way that sustains the object's mystery. So let's take the first part of that. Like, if we're watching a film, in some way our desire is involved in it, right? I think that's uncontroversial to say.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone can see that. But there's something in this kind of movement of desire, if we're thinking about it in terms of the objet a, which means Lacan's term, the objet a, means, to a degree, like the thing that is in the object that is more than the object.
Yeah. So if you think of like an object of our desire, there's something within it that's more than just that mere object, and that is desire.
Yeah, it doesn't coincide with what the subject thinks it's desiring in the object, and it doesn't just amount to objectifying, which is kind of a silly way of thinking about it. Like,
yeah, it's the point at which the gaze or the object looks back at us. There's something within it that reflects back to us, and that's the gaze, I think, describing it as.
Yeah. So Lacan, Todd says, describes this process at work in the visual drive. What is the subject trying to see? What he is trying to see, make no mistake, is the object as absence. What he is looking for is not, as one says, the phallus, but precisely its absence. So as opposed to this, this reading of film as discerning, the vagaries of the male gaze or whatever,
or like ideologically determining us in some way.
Yeah. There's some kind of stand-in for the absence of the object to manifest, which was captured very well in The Birds, but there are many examples of this in film, which we're going to go into. But yeah, so this idea that there's some kind of like there's an absence, there's a like an excess in the object of the gaze.
Well,
yeah.
I think
So
he's
what's
describing that the
here?
gaze is the visual form of desire, right?
In a way, but it's not actually like it's not perspicuous. It's not like the gaze. It's a complicated point Lacan is making about the gaze because it's not something that you literally see, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's that which you see, which is like more than what you're saying and less than, I guess, in a way. Because it's not merely the objects of your perception, it's all the implications of that object and what they entail for your desire.
Yeah.
So the idea is that the objet art takes on different forms. So like the objet art in the visual field is the gaze, In the oral field, it's the voice. So the gaze and voice are two different forms of the same lost object. So it's the object that marks an absence in the visual or oral field that manifests the subject's desire.
Yeah. So rather than the gaze being a manifestation of mastery or an attempt at mastery, Todd says here, the gaze is a blank spot in the subject's look that threatens the subject's sense of mastery in looking because the subject cannot see the spot directly. So there's this disruptive element to the gaze rather than it being what's the word? Formative or something, or
constitutive. So he says so the gaze then is objective. So he says grasping the gaze as objective rather than subjective transforms our understanding of the filmic experience. Instead of being an experience of imaginary mastery, it becomes, at least potentially, the site of a traumatic encounter with the real, with the utter failure of the spectator's seemingly safe distance and assumed mastery. So film can implicate us in a way that complicates this whole dynamic that Lacanian theory is suggesting that our desire is one of mastery.
Yeah, so it instead of leading us towards a notion of like completeness on the imaginary level, it leads us towards a kind of lacking confrontation with it, or a confrontation with lack. Something that is paradoxically he describes as non-specular and is not graspable in the image or by the image alone.
Yeah, he's saying that this failure to grasp what we desire is what is enjoyable about film, is what is desirable about film.
Yeah, because it suggests plenitude.
Right.
So his first example is the Silence of the Lambs, which is in some sense a standard kind of detective narrative, and almost seems like a TV show that would later,
Yeah.
But what complicates this whole dynamic is our fixation our investment with the serial killer himself, with Anthony Hopkins.
Hannibal Lecter,
yeah.
Yeah, because we enjoy Lecter's desire.
Right. Yeah.
We find ourselves implicated as spectators.
Yeah, he's not merely the villain. He's like the most kind of like transfixing character of the film. And the very famous line, what is it? I'm eating.
I'm having a friend over. I'm having a friend for dinner.
Yeah, I'm having a friend
over for dinner.
Yeah. He of course there's the pun, but also that it's like you're enjoying it because you're kind of in on the joke with him.
Okay, but I have a question. This is a piece of dialogue. And we're trying to talk here about the gaze.
Yeah, so I get what you mean, but I think importantly, the idea is the gaze isn't necessarily actually visual. So there's a difference between like I and EYE for Lacan. So in the visual field, that stain or the blot, as Zizek called it in the previous episode, the Hitchcockian blot, it's a point. It's not an object in the visual field that you can actually identify. We've got to keep in mind that it's the objet, right? It's not like an empirical, actual material object. It's an absence.
And it's the point in the picture of the stain, right? In the anamorphous. Do you think Zizek's term for this is parallax view?
Yeah, it moves from looking awry to parallax.
Yeah.
And anamorphosis is like his whole work, basically.
Yeah, it can in some ways be condensed into that formulation.
It's a key, at least. It's a massive key to interpreting or to reading Zizek.
And parallax view is exactly this. Like the objective field is disrupted by the subject, which sort of like reformulates it as having its own desire wrapped up in it, And in
And
some
that
way,
the reverse is true.
Yeah.
The subject is complicated by the objective field as well.
Mhm.
So neither exists in this kind of total and contained sense.
Yeah, the field is distorted both
Mhm.
ways.
Mhm.
I read like the whole section on the gays. It's like
Oh, yeah,
60
that's-
pages.
Yeah, right. I read that recently and I did not retain anything.
No, of course not. Of course not. But reading, so I read a fair bit of The Real Gays, like the Todd McGowan book, not the film analysis part, but all the intro shit. Those 60 pages, this essay. And then I try to find anything on the internet for it, and the internet sucks for it.
For
Like I looked for like 2 days. There's just nothing good on the gays. Todd's the only guy writing on the gays properly.
discourse fucking abounds. You know,
Yeah.
like if it's like art history 101, basically at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the most discussed. I mean, it's the most discussed Lacanian term with the least amount of
Lacan in it.
Lacan in it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it's also the key by which a lot of people attempt to understand contemporary art or art in general, actually, as like the medium of looking and seeing, right?
Yeah, the role of the spectator, right?
Mm-hmm. And there's a version. I think it's funny. It's called audience. What is it called?
Like where the audience has to participate in the show itself or whatever.
There's that, but it's also like the theory of the spectator. Anyway, what that obviously misses is like they're like, okay, looking at the spectator as either passive or active, right? But there's like a role that the subject is playing here that is very different than that.
Yeah, I have a friend who was an actor in a play where one of the main premises of the play was that the audience could stop the play and kind of interject themselves.
It was disastrous
to the point where the play ended because it had become a site wherein people would stop the play and say that the play was insufficient because it did not properly center them as the viewer in the play,
which is exactly what they were trying to do.
Yes. So it was like it was a catastrophe, but also like kind of funny.
Well, part of the difficulty with this episode is that the gays. What I realize is that why I'm finding it difficult is that the gaze is objet R, and objet R is fucking difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, okay, maybe his next example kind of clarifies it a bit. Maybe like it's not merely that we desire what Hannibal Lecter desires, is that there's something crucial in film where the desire process is unclear, right? It's kind of hidden.
Yeah, it's not meant to encounter the object. Desire is not meant to encounter the object.
Yeah. So what's more
contrary,
successful according to Todd is when we never get a full description of the desire in film. Yeah. Like where it's forever kind of delayed and never arrived at.
Yeah, I want to use this
because we
example.
encircle desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I use this example early on in the podcast, but I kept thinking about it. The distinction between The Lighthouse and the movie Annihilation. It works because they both feature they both kind of orbit around something being in a lighthouse. And it also struck me that the lighthouse is a nice metaphor for a thing that sees too.
Yeah, then they're made like roughly the same year, like within a couple years of each other.
Within a year, yeah.
And have massively different approaches to displaying the lighthouse, right? And the entity within it.
With the entity within. So at the end of The Lighthouse, Robert Pattinson's character is you're seeing him see the thing in the lighthouse, and it is an incredibly traumatic experience for him. And it's also pretty, it's traumatic to see this Yeah, it's just sort of like, and then versus in Annihilation, the thing in the lighthouse is shown, and it's a guy dancing around for like 11 minutes in a morph suit. It is severely disappointing experience. But it struck me that like between the two, the lighthouse understood as the distinction between gaze as objet as irreducible to the field of vision, as non-specular, as eluding imaginary incorporation, as traumatic, giving body to the void. And in Annihilation, they're trying to kind of domesticate the objet and to like fully manifest it.
Yeah, to describe, to not leave it to make it an object for viewing rather than the much more successful depiction of desire in the lighthouse, which is this like presence of the void, like and the trauma of the void, the trauma of the real,
yeah.
So Todd uses the film The Duel to describe this process. Spielberg's first film, and
Which
it's
is
very
quite
good. Yeah. It's maybe it's like kind of, I think his attempt at kind of a Hitchcocky type thriller.
Definitely.
What came first, Duel or Road Games?
Duel. Road Games is like 10 years later, but
Road Games is the Australian one.
Yeah. Road Games is awesome. It's really good. It's another. I love like highway thrillers.
Yeah,
with trucks.
The Hitcher. Hitcher? Yeah, that's what I was going to say. The Hitcher.
That one's great.
Kiwi film.
Yeah. Okay, so Duel, like Todd describes that what happens in Duel is that so a businessman is driving, and it becomes confusingly the focus of a truck driver's rage who's trying to kill him, and he doesn't know why. And what Todd describes as the particularly successful part of the film is that you never find out why, and you never actually see the driver of the truck. You're just located in this kind of hysterical moment of like, what does he want? And it's the answer is never provided.
Right, and he says that this reveals that the gaze as objet constantly eludes our grasp, not because it is a transcendental object existing beyond all signification, but because it gives body to a void.
Right, and that's because you can never know the desire of the other.
This is also, I think, in North by Northwest, right? Like Roger Thornhill, or Cary Grant's character, kind of becomes Roger Thornhill accidentally, and he spends the movie kind of trying to figure out, like, both dealing with the repercussions of becoming this non-person, this person that doesn't actually exist, and simultaneously like occupying the role of a Roger Thornhill. Like he's like kind of, he gives body to this void of Roger Thornhill, right? And when Roger Thornhill is like, the closest he comes to being a person is being an empty suit.
And so, yeah, you never figure out why the kind of crux of the action is occurring. Okay, so what then is Todd saying with these examples?
He says that they're radical in the sense of their fidelity to the idea of the gaze as fundamentally non-specular, as absent in the picture. The gaze is the object cause of the spectator's desire, but the spectator never encounters the gaze.
That's right.
Which is the problem with Annihilation once again.
So Lacanian theory, and I think what he's describing is the kind of like prevailing perception these days, is that there's something kind of inherently problematic about the way that film works, right? In that it either ideologically commands us, or rather in the way that it ideologically commands us. Like I found myself wondering, like, if you're a film critic who views film this way, like, why do you even like film? Like, what is preferable about film? And is there a way to enjoy it without that? Because I think from that perspective, there isn't. So this is a very, very like joyless way of encountering film.
Mm-hmm. He has this whole bit about fantasy. Should we talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So Todd thinks that there is kind of a way out here, a way that film can act that is simultaneously like, yes, is like subject to ideology, but also resists it.
Mm-hmm. So like there is a way that film utilizes fantasy to domesticate, he says, the object gaze.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a disruption that occurs with fantasy, and which our interaction with film doesn't just have to be with come from like the obscurity of art house movements. Like we can see this most profoundly in classical Hollywood films.
Mm-hmm. Like the way that fantasy enters film is that, like as your example of Annihilation, it gives us a conclusion to desire. It gives us a kind of comfortable narrative in which the trauma of our desire is resolved. The classic romantic film, for instance, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that he says stages a fantasy scenario that solves the impossibility presented by the gaze.
Yeah, fantasy provides a rationale for the inherent deadlock of desire. It constructs a scene in which the jouissance we are deprived of is concentrated in the other who stole it from us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's a way of avoiding, for Todd is suggesting, avoiding the real of the gaze.
Mm-hmm.
A comfortable way of suturing over that trauma.
And at the same time, fantasy reveals the inconsistency of an ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's supposedly like the function that it performs is a covering over, but it never achieves its aim.
Yeah, I mean, like if it needs to cover over, then there's an inconsistency there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is
the very need for it.
Yeah, this is Zizek's point. Like again, like in Sublime Objects, for instance, where like there's no outside of symbolic, outside of fantasy, outside of ideology, but yet there are inconsistencies in it.
Yeah, so it's there that you have an encounter with the real.
Mm-hmm.
In that inconsistency, that fantasy is there to cover over, but it always fails.
There's a negativity to fantasy as well that works against the positive instantiations of it, apparently, in the film.
Because the idea is that fantasy provides some kind of screen in front of the gaze that allows you to avoid the trauma. So fantasy functions as a way of avoiding the real of the gaze. But at the same time, its presence belies this contradiction.
Right. And this is the point of looking at film in terms of objet art, which I believe I poo-pooed a couple months ago.
What did you say?
The notion that such an interpretation amounts to basically saying, and this is the objet art, ta-da. Which was a dumb thing to say. Because, and this is going back to our last episode too, like Zizek interprets the quilting point not in terms of a master signifier, but in terms of the objet art. So like that little key or blot or stain in the film that is the site of the sort of confounded desire of the subject, the point at which the work sort of looks back at you, not expressly, but kind of in these terms of that is complicated by the object and fantasy and desire.
Yeah, it's the cause of desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe what you might have been resistant to is the suggestion that film must always be seen this way. But I think that's kind of what Todd is saying here, is that no, there's moments where film is successful at this, but and his problem with the like Lacanian theorists or the post theory is that it kind of renders film as like always a process of something.
Yeah, I think the term domestication is really good.
Yeah. However, Todd does say something here that I think is going a bit far. He says, instead of lamenting the phantasmatic dimension of the cinema, we should view it as an opportunity for an encounter with the gaze as an encounter with the real that otherwise would be impossible. Otherwise would be impossible? I'm not so sure. Like, is film really the only way that you can encounter this?
I think the reason why he says that it is the only way is because for Lacan, the scopic drive, so the drive of like the visual itself is so primary.
Right, but so like before film was invented, no one had ever lamented the
So
phantasmatic
it's other than dreams.
and viewed it as an opportunity for an encounter with the gaze and encounter with the real. That didn't happen before film.
I know what you mean. I think the idea is though that the visual field is so, how would you put it?
I'm not doubting that
that
film
the,
is
the
maybe
phrase
an
impossible there is
example
is not innocuous. He means it in the Lacanian sense, as the objet A being an impossible object.
No, he says we should view it as an opportunity to encounter the gaze. Wait, sorry, an opportunity for an encounter with the gaze. I think he's suggesting that film is the only way to encounter this, encounter the real in this way.
Read it one more time.
Okay. So he says, instead of lamenting the phantasmatic dimension of the cinema, we should view it as an opportunity for an encounter with the gaze. An encounter with the real that would otherwise be impossible.
Yeah. Not that viewing film in that way would otherwise be, not that viewing it in the film would otherwise be impossible, but that the encounter with the real
of the gaze in the film. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. I read that. I was like, wait, the film is the only place where this
He
happens?
means it in terms of the impossible object, I think.
In film. But then it's just a statement that what we encounter in film is impossible without the encounter of film.
No. What we encounter in the film, when we're encountering the object on the film, rendered in such a way, read it one more time. Or I'll just look this up.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Michael, what do you think?
I'm not sure now.
There you go.
I totally understand what you're driving at. Let's have a look.
I think he was just getting a little carried away with his point. That would otherwise be impossible.
Yeah, I see what you mean. No, he is saying that.
So yeah, come on. I don't know. Because either
got
way,
carried away.
Yeah, he got carried away. Or he's saying that what we encounter in film is only possible through film. It's like, well, yeah.
Well, that's not such a terrible point.
It's not, but it strikes me as not a huge point to make.
Because it's circular.
Yeah, it's like what you get out of visiting Paris is by visiting Paris, you know.
Yeah, right. I see what you mean. How long have we been going here?
I think we're good to we've been going for a while, but I'm gonna have to cut a lot out. But I think this discussion is actually interesting.
When we don't have Jake here, we're about 10 to 15 minutes short.
Yeah.
We need Jake's prolixity.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
well, you want to bitch about David Lynch for a second?
Nah, we all know we know how we feel about David Lynch. He sucks.
But have we ever said it on the podcast before?
I don't have any time for people going on about how great David Lynch is.
So wait, okay, so
listen,
the
he's
culmination,
fucking annoying, okay, that's all I need to say.
It is annoying. So where Todd brings David Lynch into this is that he thinks that David Lynch is able to combine in a convincing way the way in which the object of desire is hidden, say in Duel, and the kind of use of fantasy to in a successful way, rather than fantasy being kind of just enacting ideology. He thinks that David Lynch is kind of able to contain both the image of kind of the gaze and desire and fantasy within the same film.
Mm-hmm.
I just kind of think that David Lynch is annoying. What do you
Counterpoint. David Lynch is annoying.
Yeah, he's just annoying. I always thought that, maybe this is just my poor taste and I just don't get it. And maybe that's probably what it is, but it doesn't work on me. It doesn't work with me.
So, brutally, it still feels like every time I watch a David Lynch film, I'm like, oh, it's like someone gave a first year film student a lot of money. In one of the Hitchcock interviews I was listening to, the interviewer was saying to Hitchcock that in film schools, what you see is in their first year, everybody creates a film like Bergman, and in their final year, they make a film like Hitchcock.
Well, yeah, well, I mean, with all
What does
this,
Hitchcock say to that?
Well, it's funny because like a lot of that, this might hold because like Spielberg's first film is basically doing like Hitchcock.
Yeah.
I think like a lot of great directors from that era are kind of doing their own version of Hitchcock.
Brian De Palma,
Yeah.
Yeah, big time.
Truffaut, Louis Malle.
Who's Louis Malle?
He made that one we were talking about a couple weeks ago, Elevator to the Gallows. That's his first movie. It's really good. He also made My Dinner with Andre.
Oh, right.
Right.
Yeah, I think I was a bit too pissed to write all that down.
So it's funny, you know, like one of the general points that Todd's making here is that like film theory was kind of led astray by this overemphasis on a misinterpretation of Lacan, which had the effect basically of simplifying the relationship between subject and object, between spectator and the images on the screen, and it condemned its adherents to analyses that never saw the traumatic nature of the gaze in the cinematic experience. He says that like fantasy, film is a knife that cuts both ways. That cuts in both directions. It can provide crucial support for ideology, filling in the blank spot within the structure of ideology. But it can also, and this is what traditional Lacanian film theory missed, take us to an encounter with the gaze that would otherwise be obscured in our experience of social reality. Which he went a little farther by saying film is the only place that you can do this. I would also say that you can do this in literature or maybe even in philosophy. Who knows?
But yeah, that's the base. Yeah, that there's something like this is what we were saying earlier. It's like, are we to condemn film to be purely kind of like just a way that we become kind of indoctrinated, or is there something in it that can be like a way of like depicting how desire works and
and kind of like sustaining the traumatic core of the real, like sustaining that as a function of the gaze, rather than in the thing I was referencing earlier, that silly YouTube video, which ended by saying like, I want to read you the last thing that they said. It was quite funny. The film shows us how true love, the willingness to gaze upon someone, to truly see them and accept the same in return, shows that love can stand the test of time.
I love that last part of the line. And just like that's just not like, even from what she's saying, it's not an obvious like implication.
No, and this idea of like this domesticated gaze, right? Like the one that the gaze that fully knows itself and assumes itself and sees truly the other and the other truly seeing them. Like this is not
film,
what Lacan is saying about
yeah,
this.
and film is like at its best when we're theorizing about it. There's ambiguity intertwined with it, right? It's that thrill, that suspense, that implication. The like what is depicted, but is about what is not depicted, right?
Which makes Hitchcock's movies we were talking about last week, a film like Rear Window, such an amazing encounter with this idea of the gaze and fantasy. Like,
that's good. I think
in
Go ahead,
Pervert's Guide to Cinema, Zizek says that cinema teaches us how to desire, right? And if desire is always the desire of the other, it's the manner in which the visual field is organized for our desire.
Right.
So the gaze functions there, right?
How does desire certainly not being getting what you want, because that's kind of 101.
Yeah.
The getting what you desire leads always to the perpetuation of desire and is deeply unsatisfying.
Yeah, which is why the end of films is always such a letdown.
Much like the end of this podcast. So thank you everyone for listening.
Music and so on, where you do not get what you want.
I think that's a good place to end it, fellas. Yeah. So Jizak and so on, Michael, Peter, Will. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Enjoy.
And so on and so on. 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 And so on and so on.